So if the recording is in progress, then it is probably high time to introduce our favorite two-dimensional lecturer, only two-dimensional in the way we see him, not in his content, but really so fortunate to have a little walk through of Winterreise before we experience it on Sunday. In Dr. Aaron Ziegel's good care. So very excited to hear what he has to say about this towering work. And enough from me. Welcome back, Dr. Ziegel, and thank you for being with us.
Thanks, everybody. It is a great pleasure to be here, joining you at Opera Delaware once again. So let me set the stage here for what Winterreise requires of us as audience members. This is a kind of piece that requires an incredible degree of concentration on the part of the performers and the pianists, the vocalists and the pianists in particular, because we're dealing with such a mammoth work resting entirely on the shoulder of two performers. It requires a lot of concentration on our part as audience members, because we are, after all, dealing with over an hour worth of music for just one voice, accompanied by just one piano in German. And so be prepared to commit, I think, is the biggest warning that I can give you right now. Be prepared to commit to what this work gives, because if, as listeners, we are able to approach it with the kind of commitment that not just this work, but so much of Schubert's music requires, it can be a really overwhelming emotional experience. And so I hope that through the time we'll spend together this evening, I might be able to unlock some of the historical background to this work and hopefully share some analytical insight into what it is that is going on in this composition. I suspect many of you will have heard Winterreise before, whether in recording or live in person, but I suspect there will also be a contingent of your audience coming to it new for the first time. This is by no means entry-level art song material. This asks a lot of listeners, and it has been a great pleasure for me to get to spend some time diving into this work and thinking about how to put together my thoughts. So I'm very pleased to be bringing them to you tonight. Again, I'm Aaron Ziegel, joining you from my office on Towson University's campus. Let's get going. You can see my screen now, I believe, so we're all set. Now, I want to step back sort of the furthest distance possible from our work itself and start at a point that may seem, in fact, too obvious of a beginning. But it is a word that can help us to think about how we conceive of the idea of a song, what is meant by a song, and how we as listeners approach the idea of a song, how composers approach the idea of a song. Because understanding the song, the sort of core building block out of which Schubert constructs this song cycle, Winterreise, gives us, I think, a good framework to see the magnificent edifice that our composer has constructed here. So let's start with song. And I want you to reflect, if you would, on songs that you love. This might be a pop song, this might be a folk song, this might be something you knew as a child, this might be some really sophisticated bit of composition, but regardless of what song you think of, something new, something old, something popular, something classical, the characteristics of what make that song work are going to be the same in any of these musical fields. And so here are what I think of as the three essential ingredients for making a song good. And I realize that good is like one of the least musicological words I could choose, but if we were able to come up with good songs, we'd all be millionaires. That's really the trick, isn't it? What makes a song good is this mysterious thing that's so hard to latch on to. And so we can sort of conceptualize what makes a song good. Well, it needs to have a good tune, first of all. Some melodic idea that is worth listening to. A tune gets us only so far, though, because the song's accompaniment is equally important in how that song has an impact. In our case, we're dealing with songs for voice and piano with composed accompaniments, but this is true if we're talking about the latest pop hit on the Hot 100 chart of Billboard right now. How that song is accompanied is equally important to its impact. And lastly, of course, a song is nothing if we're not singing words that carry a meaning of some sort. And so achieving a source of text that is emotive in what it conveys to listeners is important here. All three of these things are necessary in any type of song. And what it boils down to, really, I think, is memorability. And notice that I'm not exactly defining any of these terms as I am, again, giving a sort of a framework to think about the aesthetics of how songs function. If those elements, the good tune, the memorable accompaniment, the emotive lyrics, if those things all bound together to achieve an experience that is memorable, then the song will work. And again, if we could do this successfully, we'd all be millionaires. Sticking with our word song, then, let's think about categories of types of songs. We, in our context, are dealing with that middle one, an art song. And we use the term art song in the English language. In German, they would refer to these songs as Lieder in the plural or a Lied in the singular. There are terms in French, terms in Russian, in all the language groups to refer to this kind of song. In English, again, we call it an art song. And the implication is that an art song is a composed genre of music. The composer has thought up precisely what the composer wants the performers to do and notated it on the page. The performers thus are not improvising, they are not rearranging, they are doing what the composer has written. That's the art element of an art song. A folk song, in contrast, is generally passed down through the oral tradition. Yes, of course, these could be notated. Yes, they could have accompaniments arranged to accompany the folk melody, but at its core, it is an element of oral tradition with likely an anonymous composer. Only in rare occasions can we actually point to the sole individual creative mind that thought it up, versus an art song, again, as a composed genre. We almost always know whose name to attach to that work. Since a folk song is part of the oral tradition, accompaniments will vary depending on the situation. Now, pop songs, on the other hand, popular songs, are likewise, at their core, a composed genre. When Gershwin writes a song, he is thinking about it from the notational standpoint. Even when Taylor Swift writes a song, she is probably on some level thinking about it from a notational standpoint. But the key difference in a popular song, though, is that there is not the expectation that performers must adhere to the composer's notation on the page. In a popular song, the accompaniment is likely generated by, say, the band itself, if we're talking about, say, Taylor Swift. Or in the Gershwin context, if we go back to Great American Songbook, the accompaniment is generated from an arrangement that expands upon what the composer has notated. Or perhaps a popular song is subject to improvisation, where it is only the framework of the melody and its underlying choral structure that is what the composer is creating, and the rest is left to the performers and the musicians in the moment to realize that accompaniment. Now, these seem like they are very fixed categories, but Schubert's case, I think, is especially distinctive when we try to examine these categories, because there are certain art songs in which Schubert is most definitely trying to sound like a folk song. There are songs in which Schubert is, even if he is creating his own melody, writing it to sound as if it could possibly be a folk song. And we can blur it in the other direction too. Yes, we think of Schubert's music as art song because they are composed, notated on the page, and to be performed as notated. But of course, some Schubert songs are wildly popular. And during his lifetime, despite Schubert's many financial struggles and despite Schubert's lack of recognition and success in many of the genres in which he composed, his songs were the one area of his output that was in fact wildly popular and of great financial success to Schubert. Musicologists have taken the time to track down sales figures from the decades of the 1810s and 1820s, and there are some years in which Schubert's art songs outsold any other composer in all of Vienna. This is a remarkable feature. So when we're talking about popularity, Schubert was, just like some of his songs today, remain wildly popular. And so if we're thinking about who is Schubert outselling at the music shops, well, Beethoven is his exact contemporary. And so Beethoven was coming in second place or even further down the list to Schubert in some years because of the popularity of these songs. So again, for our context, art song is probably the best of these terms, despite all of the blurriness that can come in these categories. Regardless, again, of which type of song we're talking about, we are looking for good tunes, interesting accompaniment, and emotive lyrics. Now, what Schubert is trying to do in Winterreise is to create what we call a song cycle. The German term Liederzyklus was in fact in use at the time. So this is a term that Schubert is aware of. The idea of composing songs in a cycle, though, is quite new. It is a relatively radical, cutting edge, almost even avant-garde conception for how songs should behave. Songs on a pop record designed for radio play today, as you know, are about 3 minutes in duration. And if we go backwards in music history, where does that duration come from? Well, that's about the length it fits on one side of a 45 record. If we go backwards in music history from then, that's about the duration of the side of the music that fits on one side of a 10-inch 78 record. And if we go backwards in time again, we find that art songs written by Brahms or Schubert or even earlier in history are generally about that same length. So the song, uniquely for the sort of major genres of European classical music, the song is far and away the shortest and least substantive of those genres. Being built from small blocks, and given that composers in the early 19th century are generally spending their time writing much longer genres, like the symphony or the string quartet or the piano sonata or opera, to focus on the ones that Schubert spent much of his time with, it comes as no surprise that composers are looking for ways to build something that is more substantive, of greater structural importance, and consequently of greater length and duration than the song by itself generally can sustain. And this is where the idea of a song cycle comes into play. The song cycle tries to take individual songs as the building block and string a whole bunch of them together, so that the song, rather than just being this instant encapsulated in music, can now tell something of the type of ongoing, larger scale structure like an opera might. So a song cycle is, in its most basic definition, a collection of a series of songs that the composer intends to be performed, number one, in their entirety, and number two, in the order that the composer has planned them out. That is our foundational definition for the song cycle. Winterreise is one of the great examples of what is possible in the genre of song cycle. Now, as I said, though, this is a relatively radical, new, cutting-edge, even avant-garde and forward-looking genre. So let's look at some of the important precedents, all from Schubert's contemporaries. And notice, too, the dates that we're examining here. Beethoven, Carl Maria von Weber, and Schubert all died in very close proximity to one another. Weber goes first, Beethoven next, Schubert last, but within the span of less than 2 years, these great composers all pass away. Beethoven did have a relatively full career and a longish lifespan. Schubert and Weber, on the other hand, died very young when they were at the heights of their powers, and so there's definitely a sense of sort of promise unfulfilled with both of those composers. Back earlier than Beethoven, we do find song composers who are experimenting with the idea of putting more than one song together. For instance, Mozart writes some songs where he singly and separately draws texts from the same sources, and so maybe that's kind of a song cycle, but it's really just sort of closely related pieces rather than the actual cyclical idea of a continuous series meant to be performed in its entirety. The first ever true song cycle is Beethoven's On die ferne Geliebte. Now, in 1816, when Beethoven writes this song cycle, Schubert is far and away the most popular and successful song composer in Vienna. And Schubert, it seems, was sort of angling towards the idea of constructing a series of songs put together to make one larger work. Beethoven beats him to the punch. And Beethoven does it so well and so successfully that Schubert is sort of taken aback by this and takes some time to regather his thoughts and figure out what one should do now that Beethoven has thrown down the gauntlet so successfully. So, An die ferne Geliebte, this is To the Distant Beloved. As the title suggests, our protagonist is longing for his distant beloved, and he sings a bunch of songs about how he feels about that. So that's what's going on in An die ferne Geliebte. The next to the market is Karl Maria von Weber, a composer not particularly well known for his song cycles, but he writes a set of 4 songs in November of 1816, so just a few months after Beethoven's have appeared. He calls these pieces the 4 temperaments at the loss of the beloved. So it is not a narrative continuous in the sense that An die ferne Geliebte is, or in the sense that Schubert's song cycles are. Rather, it is a set of 4 songs that each look at different angles about how we respond when we've been dumped. That's what Weber is into in these 4 songs. And so he takes the 4 classical temperaments. One might be really sad about it. One might be overjoyed to find one's freedom again. One might be nostalgic about it. These 4 classical temperaments is what he's going with there. Schubert finally gets in the game in August of 1818 with a work that is indeed a song cycle, although it is not really considered one because of where Schubert goes next in his output. But in 1818, 2 years have passed since Beethoven's landmark song cycle has been on the market, and Schubert decides to try to meet Beethoven on his own terms. And he writes what is published under just a single title, Einsom Kite, Loneliness. Like Beethoven's, it is a series of 6 interconnected songs that all proceed one after another with segues in between. It's a very large-scale work for a single song. It runs more than 20 minutes in duration, and there is much wonderful music here. It doesn't get performed as frequently as I think it ought to. It's sort of hard to program such a large single song in the context of an art song recital. It's not enough for a full program, but if you're doing mostly short songs, how do you deal with this 20 to 25-minute thing? Schubert, again, is clearly trying to emulate the Beethoven model. And with the success of Einsom Kite behind him, Schubert takes the next great leap forward in the nature of this genre song cycle. Across many months in the middle of 1823, Schubert composes his first of 2 song cycles to the texts of the poet Wilhelm Mueller. This one is called The Beautiful Miller Girl, or Die schöne Müllerin. It is a 75-minute long composition that uses a series of poems that tells an entire narrative of the love of this man for the beautiful Miller girl. There is nothing like this in the history of music until Schubert writes it. He is almost single-handedly redefining what a song cycle could be. To have that many songs across that duration, all telling one continuous story. It is an unbelievable challenge compared to what has gone before for a singer and a pianist to put together something of this scope and scale. I suspect that Schubert did not make great money selling this because, again, who out there in the market of people that have been buying his relatively popular songs wants a 75-minute long, well, I think concept album to bring it to a parallel in our modern day take on this. And indeed, the idea of a song cycle and the idea of like a prog rock band concept album is precisely the same. A larger structure built up of smaller component parts that put together the work as a whole yields more than any of the individual pieces. Finally, then, we jump ahead towards near the end of Schubert's life when he writes Winterreise in 2 distinct phases February of 1827 and October of 1827. So we'll talk more specifically about the chronology of that work in just a moment. But here's our cast of characters, so to speak. The composer Franz Schubert and his close contemporary Wilhelm Mueller. Notice that, like Schubert, Mueller also dies very, very young. Mueller and Schubert did not know each other. Schubert, as a literary engaged person, only knew Mueller's works from his publications. They are living in very different parts of the German-speaking world. Schubert spends his entire life in Vienna, but Mueller is resident primarily in Dessau, spent some time in Berlin as well, so up in the central Germany part of the world versus Vienna in Austria. Although they did not know each other, Wilhelm Mueller clearly understood that there might be great potential for his poems to serve as art song lyrics. I want to present for you two different primary source quotations from Wilhelm Mueller, both taken from his letters to his friends, which give us a remarkable glimpse into how Mueller conceives of this relationship between the poetry that he is writing and his hoped for one day in the future musical settings. So we'll go first to a quote from a letter in October 1815. Mueller writes this: "I can neither play nor sing, yet when I write verses, I sing and play after all. If I could produce the tunes, my songs would please better than they do now. But courage, a kindred spirit may be found who will hear the tunes behind the words and give them back to me." Now, we need to be careful about not overreading this. It seems like he's somehow mystically wishing for the arrival of Schubert on the scene, but probably he had friends in his own circle who were composers who he was hoping would render his poetry in music. Again, he and Schubert do not know each other. But he revisits this theme about the importance of his poems becoming text for songs, again in December of 1822. "My songs lead but half a life, a paper life of black and white, until music breathes life into them, or at least calls it forth and awakens it if it is already dormant in them." These are remarkable statements. You know, we often find poets who are not particularly enthused at what composers have done to mutilate their text through musical settings that they don't like. So Mueller is obviously very open to the idea of composers bringing musicalizing to his texts. So here's the chronology from Mueller's end. In 1823, he publishes a set of poems, just 12 of them, under the title Die Winterreise. Notice the article at the beginning, the Winter's Journey. This was just a selection of half of the 24 poems that Mueller actually authored. Apparently the publisher didn't want to take the whole thing, so Mueller selected just half of them and published them in that initial form. A year elapses until finally his full collection is published, thus spanning the full 24 that he originally intended, and dropping the article, so now it is not the Winter's Journey, but rather just plain Winter's Journey. Before seeing what Schubert has made of them, Mueller dies. He's just 33 years old and he dies of a stroke on the 1st of October, 1827. Unbeknownst to him, Schubert had at some point come into possession of a copy of the initial publication of Die Winterreise, the 12-text half collection. And in February of 1827, a few months before Mueller dies, Schubert is in not a good place at all. Now, given that we don't have detailed medical records, it's hard to know precisely the medical history here, but it seems like probably sometime around when Schubert was a teenager, and he was exploring his adulthood, shall we say. It seems from the documentary evidence that survives that Schubert probably picked up a case of syphilis from a prostitute that he visited in Vienna. This hounded him for the rest of his life. Of course, syphilis is not treatable at this time in medical history, and it would flare up from time to time, and one particularly bad flare-up was February 1827, when Schubert is suffering dreadfully from his syphilis. This has pushed him into a terrible period of depression and thus, he turns to the text of Mueller's The Winter Journey, which admittedly is a fairly depressing text, especially in its initial form. It traces somebody who's been dumped and is trying to find his way through the world and not having a very good luck of finding how to move on from this very painful personal loss. These are the 12 songs that Schubert set. So for Schubert, this sadness, this mourning, this depression of the loss of a beloved is right in the territory of what he is experiencing in his personal life. So he sets these 12 songs, and he is working with a publisher trying to get them in print, when lo and behold, he discovers that he's only done half the job. This was somewhat frustrating to Schubert. Indeed, the publication was already underway of the 12 he had, and so this presents him with a conundrum. Should he follow Mueller's order, in which case he would have to slam the brakes on the publication, tell his publisher to break it up into its component parts so that he can then insert into the sequence the other 12 poems, because it's not a 12 plus 12, it's this intermingling of the two sets. Schubert ultimately decides that what he wants to do is this. He will simply set the poems of the full 24 that he hasn't already set in the order in which they appear after the 12 he's already set. So Schubert's Winterreise, in fact, gives us a jumbled arrangement of Mueller's text. And consequently, this totally rebalances the nature of the emotive narrative. Mueller's Winterreise is, in fact, a story of how one emerges from the personal loss, tragedy, and depression that one feels to a new understanding of life and a pathway forward. Schubert, having only set 12 to begin, sees this as very depressing music, and he wants it to pretty much end that way too. Consequently, he very much rebalances the sort of outcome of this narrative that he's working with. Part 1 is published in January 1828. So the publisher simply takes the first 12 as Schubert had them, went ahead and published that, and then the 12 later poems that Schubert set in October of 1827 finally come out in print in December 1828, just a month after Schubert had died. In fact, one of his final tasks in the days leading up to his death was to go through the publisher proofs of the forthcoming print to make sure that there weren't any corrections that needed to be made. So this music is, without question, bound up with Schubert recognizing that he is at the end of his life and trying to cope with that and express it through music. This is one of the main reasons why experiencing Winterreise in the concert hall is such a weighty occasion for audience members and performers alike. There's no getting off easy here. You have to commit to the emotional depths that this song cycle requires of us. Schubert did see the first half published, and so what we're looking at on the screen here is the original title page. Again, it is using the later title, just plain Winter's Journey, rather than The Winter's Journey. And it is interesting, too, to see that the title cycle does not appear here on this title page. Sometimes Schubert does use that word, but here the publisher has chosen not to. And I suspect that that is probably a calculation to not dissuade potential purchasers from what they're getting into. So there's the original title page. Now, I also want to look at how this music was first experienced by Schubert's friends, his listening audience. Schubert, as you may know, rarely performed in public. He much more preferred to perform in private settings at the homes of his friends. We even have a word for this. We call them Schubertiades, an informal type of setting where Schubert probably knew everybody who was in the audience, where there would be time to talk with the audience members there, to explain what he had in mind, to get their take, to get their feedback, their reactions on the music. So a very different setting than this modern formality of sitting quietly in a recital hall and applauding at the right time. It is into this context that Schubert first introduced the music of Winterreise. And we have an account of this from one of Schubert's friends, a man named Joseph von Spahn, who published his recollections of his encounters with Schubert, and writing of events that occurred in March 1827. So at this point, Schubert has only written the first 12 of the songs, not the full cycle, just the first 12. And Spahn recounts this. For some time, Schubert appeared very upset and melancholy. When I asked him what was troubling him, he would only say, "Soon you will hear and understand." One day he said to me, "Come over to Schuberts today and I will sing you a cycle of spine-chilling songs." He uses the German word Schauerliche. Almost makes it sound like it's a ghost story he's telling. "I will sing you a cycle." And again, here Schubert does use that word, Zyklus, to refer to this collection of compositions. "I will sing to you a cycle of spine-chilling songs. I am anxious to know what you will say about them. They have cost me more effort than any of my other songs." So he sang the entire Winterreise through to us in a voice full of emotion. We were utterly dumbfounded by the mournful, gloomy tone of these songs, and Schubert said that only one of them, Der Lindenbaum, had appealed to him. To that, Schubert replied, "I like these songs more than all the rest, and you will come to like them as well." You will recall that I have described the genre of song cycle as being, at this point in music history, something that is revolutionarily modern, forward-looking, and avant-garde. We see that reaction here from Schubert's friends, who are apparently quite flummoxed by what it is that Schubert has presented to them. They don't know what to make of it. It's so pervasively melancholy in its mood. It's interesting to note, too, that Schubert himself is accompanying and singing. This would be something to see today. A pianist sing the cycle, or rather, a singer accompany him or herself in this cycle. But apparently that is what Schubert did. And when we look at some music examples here as we're wrapping up, we'll pay attention to what it is that the pianist is asked to do. Schubert's music in this song cycle is characterized by very spare piano writing. He seems to have boiled down his accompaniments to their merest essence. There is much in the empty space for the singer to fill, and there's much intellectual concentration required of the pianist, because what on the page may look like sort of just basic, bald, almost naked chords is in fact the universe in which this music inhabits. One final point that I should make about this quote on the screen right now. You may notice this ellipsis right here. I've excerpted Spahn's comments, but in this ellipsis, in fact, quite a lot happens. For after this initial invitation to come to Schubert's house to hear the intended first run through of this music to Schubert's friends, Schubert placed the invitation, summoned his friends to Schubert's house, and then promptly didn't show up himself. He ghosted his friends on that particular evening. And it seems like probably this is just that Schubert was so ill that he couldn't bring himself to make it out of the house that day. And so some weeks later, finally, Schubert was well enough to get out of the house to be able to perform this piece. Let's look at this bit of text. This comes from the pianist Christopher Glynn, a pianist who has many times performed and also recorded Schubert's Winterreise. And I think his statement here gives us a very valuable understanding of what the experience of Winterreise is like. He describes it as a portrait of brokenness, tells the story of a wanderer who has been unlucky in love as he sets out on a long and lonely journey through a bleak, wintry landscape that mirrors the state of his own inner world. Now, this mirroring is important. It's inherent to the text. Our protagonist is feeling things that he sees reflected back to him in his surroundings. Remember that Wilhelm Müller, the author of these poems, thought that they were crying out to be musicalized by a composer. And so this reflection of the emotional content, the natural world, thus extrapolates very naturally into what Schubert, as the composer, does in his piano accompaniments. The piano accompaniments, likewise, should mirror back to the singer, just as it is mirrored back to the audience, what it is that the emotions are, I should say, how the emotions are changing and traversing over the course of this winter's journey. So we know that it is about a failed love affair. That's sort of the background context for this set of poetry. But it is interesting that it contains no love songs. It describes a journey, but it arrives nowhere in particular. Nothing much happens. So this is a journey without exactly an outcome. A journey without a goal, without an arrival point, more like a journey in which each different song gives us one facet of the melancholy bleakness of this experience. So the traveler swings between sadness and defiance, paranoia and mockery, self-delusion and a fearless contemplation of the bleakest realities of life. It begins with an ending, meaning the ending of the relationship, and ends perhaps with a beginning. No wonder his friends were dumbfounded. If you want to prepare for this performance, reading the text is worth your time. It may even be worth your time to listen up in advance. This is the kind of piece, as with any great work of classical music, that of course rewards repeated exposure. Coming to it blind on the first time, you may find yourself, much like Schubert's friends, dumbfounded at this puzzling, complicated, whatever other word, I'm lost for words right now trying to describe it, but it's a lot to get into. So please do take the time to prepare yourself. It is worth every bit of effort. Christopher Glynn said that it ends with perhaps a beginning. It is clear from the poems as Wilhelm Müller paces them out that our protagonist does arrive at a new beginning point, that he is ready to start on the next phase of his life with optimism for whatever future direction will take him, and he is wiser for the experience. Schubert seems to undercut that conclusion. Again, his first 12 songs, here the left column, are the 12 that Müller initially published. And the numbers in the brackets are the number of the poems as they appear in Müller's finished final 24 poem version. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then we sort of jump around 7, 8, 9, then we jump towards the end, 18, 19, 21, and 22. Notice that Schubert's initial ending is not at all Müller's ending. This is pretty consistently bleak, melancholy, depressing. The end, the actual end of the work, doesn't appear until Müller publishes the full set. And again, we've talked about the solution that Schubert decides he'll just pick up where he didn't set the texts. So in this case, 6, Well, he set 7, 8, and 9, thus 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, that big middle chunk, all comes next. And here the one and only exception to the pattern that Schubert has set up. If Schubert were following his pattern, he would go 20, 23, 24. But Schubert feels that that too dramatically changes the ending outcome. 23, Mut, or courage in German, seems to suggest that maybe things are on an upward trajectory, which then shapes how we read the final song, Der Leiermann. If we put Mut, courage, right before Der Leiermann, the hurdy-gurdy man, it seems like the protagonist of Winterreise is coming to a new point in his life, understanding his fellow man, recognizing that there are directions for him to go forward. But by breaking up those last two songs and by putting die Nebensonnen, that is seeing, it's a not easily translatable word, but it has to do with seeing the sun through mists that obscure and cloud the sun. This takes us in a much darker direction and leads us to perhaps not as optimistic of an outcome as Wilhelm Mueller actually attended. So that one simple reordering is of profound importance. Let's look at some examples. With the time we've got left, we'll sample from 4 different songs. And the recording that I'd like to play is perhaps not the best Winterreise that exists. So many great singers have sung this. There are literally hundreds of recordings available. To whatever taste or preferences you might have, you will find one that suits you, I am sure. The one that I have chosen, however, is played at the piano by the German pianist Tobias Koch. And I like this recording because it is played on a piano from shortly after Schubert's time. And by playing Winterreise on a period piano, we get a sense of what that first run through in 1827 with Schubert's friends might have sounded like. And the period piano has some interesting timbral effects that, in all honesty, one cannot achieve on a modern grand piano. And so this gives us a very distinctive emotional sound world through which to experience these songs. So that's where I'll draw my examples from. Let's start not with the first song, but the second, The Weather Vane. Remember, our protagonist is feeling whatever he's feeling and always finding these feelings reflected in the surroundings around him. And in this case, it appears that the protagonist is outside of the home that his formerly beloved sweetheart is now inhabiting with her new boyfriend, apparently her new husband, because it seems like they have a child now. And he's feeling very depressed to be standing outside the home of his former beloved and her husband and their child. And it is the weather vane on top of the house that is reflecting his emotions. The wind is playing with the weather vane on my fair sweetheart's house. The wind is playing with hearts. So this idea of changeability, this idea of blowing this way and that, he says he would never have sought a faithful woman within that house because apparently she, like the weather vane, has turned from him. Now the wind is blowing a different direction, therefore she is into a different man. How shall we set this in musical terms? That is our next question. And I choose this example because of the spareness of the piano writing. Now, we'll zoom in on this when we listen so we can see it a little more clearly, but let me tell you about the source that we're looking at. There are 2 extant manuscript sources for Winterreise. One is Schubert's own handwritten manuscript, which is, by the way, in the United States. It's in the Pierpont Morgan Library. It has been published in reproduction. And so here is what that one looks like. Dover has published this, and for just about $10, you can buy yourself a copy of Winterreise, reproduced in Schubert's own handwriting. It is, in all honesty, very difficult to read because Schubert is a mess. Also, there's lots of crossed out strike-throughs where Schubert decides to replace things. Probably none of this is visible because my image is so small, but it's a fascinating document to look at, but one that is very difficult to make sense of. And so sticking with this idea, though, of period sources, we'll look at this one instead. What we are seeing here is the publisher's clean copy. So the state is like this. Schubert writes his autograph. It is a mess, but it has his ideas down on the page. He hands that off to the publisher, who has to prepare a clean copy, meaning somebody rewriting out the whole thing by hand to make sure that it is legible so that it can go to the engraver, who's going to put it on the metal plates that will be used to publish the sheet music. So what we are looking at here is the clean copy. This is also a historically important source because we know that Schubert had this document in his hands as well. He was asked to proofread it before it went to the engraver, and so there are some changes he marks, some edits, and so forth. So that's what we're looking at here. Now, I first want to make a point about the spareness of Schubert's writing. At the outset, he writes a simple unison line for the piano in octaves. That is it. No chords, no harmony, no accompanimental texture, just a spare, plain unison line. It gives us a sense, though, of the loneliness that the protagonist is feeling. Schubert's piano writing is always crafted in this piece to help us, the listener, know how Schubert envisions the protagonist's feeling. So the piano is always the reflector of the protagonist's emotions to us, the listening audience. So there is nothing much more lonely than a melody in bare, naked, empty octaves in the piano. When the singer comes in, much of the vocal line is accompanied by just plain, basic, solid quarter note chords. Now, partly this was logistical. One can't very easily accompany oneself singing if one is playing very elaborate, active piano accompaniment parts. So partly this is a logistical decision. But again, the spareness is key to the very important, distinctive, and unique emotional atmosphere of Winterreise. Although it begins so sparely, remember that this is a song about the weather vane, the changing winds that blow things in very different directions than we thought they were going before, which of course gives Schubert a compelling opportunity to dramatize the wind. The singer can't do that. The singer is busy singing the text and the melody, so it is up to the piano to do that. And so after all of this spareness, almost emptiness of the piano accompaniment part, when the song reaches its conclusion, we finally get some loud chords, the rush of the wind, and so forth. Let us listen to this song in its entirety. Now, again, the text and the spareness and the wind. Here comes some music. What happened? There's my mouse. I lost my mouse for a second. We're ready. Here we go.
Spielt mit der Wetterfahne auf meine schönen Liebchens Haus. Da dacht ich schon in meinem Wahne, sie pfiff den armen Flüchtling aus. Hätte es eher bemerken sollen, des Hauses aufgestelltes Schild, so hätte niemand suchen wollen im Haus ein treues Frauenbild. Der Wind spielt drinnen mit den Herzen wie auf dem Dach, nur nicht so laut. Was fragen Sie nach meinen Schmerzen? Ihr Kind ist eine reiche Braut. Der Wind spielt drinnen mit den Herzen wie auf dem Dach, nur nicht so laut. Was fragen nach meinen Schmerzen? Was fragen Sie nach meinen Schmerzen? Ihr Kind ist eine Reisebraut.
I feel like the trill timbre in particular on the period piano is very striking. It's a very different sound than what the modern piano makes. And it gives us, well, the sense of the shivers of the wind blowing by. So, go outside and you can feel that today. Let's jump ahead to song number 5. This was the one and only one that they seemed to like at Schubert's house that day. And indeed, this one has, throughout history on, sort of stood out as one of the more popular numbers, the one most likely to be excerpted. Famously, when the Norton anthology that accompanies music history textbooks that generations of American music history students have studied from, this is the one that they chose to put in that anthology. So it's become more familiar than the song cycle as a whole. Perhaps that popularity has to do with the fact that here Schubert was really aiming at a good tune, a folk-like melody, easy to remember, and also, once again though, very characteristic piano accompaniment. Again, focused on the wind. This text is about how the wind blows through the linden tree and how its branches rustled. And the cold wind blew straight into my face. My hat flew off from my head. I did not turn back, and so on in the text. So we get, once again, lots of wind portrayals. This is a longer song. Let's just listen to a portion of it. Very characteristic piano writing at the beginning with these not quite tremolo figures in the right hand at a very fast rate of motion, even though it is a relatively slow song, clearly intended to depict the idea of rustling branches as the wind blows through them. You'll notice, though, that when the singer comes in, this elaborate piano writing is restrained, and then the piano goes back to its sort of spare chordal accompaniment mode.
Am Brunnen vor dem Tore, da steht ein Linnenbaum. Ich träumt in seinem Schatten so manchen süßen Traum. Ich schnitt in seine Rinne so manches liebe Wort. Es zog in Freud und Leide zu ewig immerfort. Ich musst auch heute wandern, vorbei in tiefer Nacht. Da hab ich noch im Dunkeln die Augen zugemacht und seine Zweige rauschten, als riefen sie mir zu. Komm her zu mir, Geselle, ihr finden zu deiner Ruhe.
And so forth. One thing to be on the listen for. Schubert uses one of the most basic of musical gestures in one of the most sophisticated ways imaginable. You will hear this throughout great quantities of Winterreise, where Schubert will switch back and forth between the major mode and the minor mode. We heard it there. We started in E major. We went to E minor in the middle of that section that we listened to. We went back to E major at the end. And it is such a subtle shift. If you know your music theory, all it takes is shifting the pitch in the middle of the chord up or down by a half step, and we've totally changed the character and color and emotional atmosphere of the music. Again, it is as simple of a gesture as a composer could possibly deploy. Schubert does it all over the place in this song cycle and always with profound emotional impact. So listen for that. All right, for time, we'll skip through the rest of this song. The next one that I'd like to look at is Einsom Kite. This is the 12th song. It marks the midway point. This is the song that Schubert originally thought was the finale, when he thought he was composing a 12-song cycle. So clearly this is an important moment, because for Schubert it is an ending point that becomes our halfway marker post instead. 3 simple stanzas, again focused on weather imagery, wind imagery, in this case a clear contrast in the last stanza that is very important. Alas that the air is so calm, alas that the world is so bright. That's how the outside world is. When storms were still raging, I was not so wretched. So the protagonist seems to be saying that when he was, fighting with his beloved, or whatever the nature of their relationship was before it fell apart, even that was not as worse as it is now, when the outside world is so beautiful and he is so tortured inside. Now you can see how if Schubert thinks this is the ending, this is clearly not an uplifting song cycle. This is meant to end in the pits of bleakness. And this, I think, explains why Schubert eventually rearranged the final 2 texts, because he wanted to still end with that kind of bleakness rather than change his whole emotional conception of what this work was about. So this song is distinctive for the way in which it dramatizes that turning point from the sort of beautiful calmness, calm, bright, to raging storms. Schubert goes through the first 10 lines of text relatively efficiently because he wants to hang out on the storms to mark this finale ending point. Again, notice the spare, basic, almost bald or naked writing. It's a very simple pattern. 2 chords in the left hand, 2 chords in the right hand, carry on. And yet from that simplest of ideas, Schubert is able to create something very evocative and successful.
Wie eine trübe Wolke durch heitere Lüfte geht, wenn in der Tanne Wipfel ein mattes Lüftchen weht, so zieh ich meine Straße dahin mit trägem Fuß. Durch helles, frohes Leben, einsam und ohne Gruß. Ach, dass die Luft so ruhig, ach, dass die Welt so licht, als noch die Stürme tobten, so elend nicht. Ach, dass die Luft so ruhig, ach, dass die Welt so licht, als noch die Stille tobten,
So that's where Schubert thought it ended. Where it actually ends, though, is with this song, The Hurdy-Gurdy Player. So let me just mention two quick things as we're running out of time here at the end. The idea of a hurdy-gurdy player would have been familiar to Mueller's readership as much as it would have been to Schubert's listenership. The hurdy-gurdy is an instrument that goes all the way back to the Renaissance, still kicks around in folk music circles today. It's a box with a crank on the end. You turn the crank, it spins wooden wheels inside that scrape against the strings. It has tuned drone strings, so it can play an accompanying drone fifth, but it also has wooden buttons on the front edge that can fret a melodic string inside, so you can play a tune atop a drone while turning the crank. Beggars on the street played the hurdy-gurdy during Schubert's time. They would have been common throughout many parts of Germany. Certainly, Schubert saw them in Vienna, just as Wilhelm Müller would have seen them in Dessau. So this is an image that would have been familiar to the listening audience. The idea of a person who is completely down on their luck, an outcast of society, stuck begging for pittances from passersby on the corner while playing the hurdy-gurdy. Schubert's and Mueller's protagonist encounters one of these people. Mueller seems to think that this encounter between the protagonist and the hurdy-gurdy man is showing that he has found a newfound sensibility of sympathy for mankind, and that this shows him on a good path going forward. Whereas Schubert seems to be suggesting that the protagonist recognizes that that is probably his end point too, that he's probably going to end up as an outcast, thrown out of society, begging for alms on the street corner, playing his hurdy-gurdy. So two very different directions here, depending on which point of view we want to take. Again, Schubert has coloristic potentials for how to compose this, and he writes it, I forgot I didn't put the score for this one in the slides. He writes this with the drone fifth of the hurdy-gurdy in the piano left hand, the folk-like melody in the piano right hand, and if played on a period piano where you have sound effects, in one of the earlier songs we heard the important impact of the mute stop on the period piano, where it puts a piece of felt in between the hammers and the strings to give it a muted timbre. But it also has another one where it puts a piece of paper in between the hammer and the strings to give it a buzz and a rattle, which is very effective for this song. So let's just put a little bit of the sound sample into your ears for what that might have sounded like if Schubert had one of these special effects on the piano that he played when he premiered this cycle. It's a very evocative effect. I'm quite fond of it, actually. Perhaps not to everyone's taste, and surely your modern Steinway won't be sounding like that. But I think an interesting performance viewpoint to take into consideration here. So that's where I come to the conclusion today. I hesitate to say I hope you enjoy the performance. I don't think this is a song cycle that is seeking enjoyment. Certainly Schubert did not write this to extend those feelings to you. But I do hope that you have a profound musical experience, because this is music that speaks with a great deal of profundity and importance of emotive communication. I hope that my talk tonight has helped you to find your way into this very rarefied world that Schubert is creating. And so thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's been my great pleasure. Thank you to those of you who are watching the recording on playback. It will be, I'm sure, a wonderful performance. Thanks a lot, folks.